I want to give you some things tonight, and I will try to be brief and be fast. But I find that some of these things, when I talk about them, people have them in the center of their heart, but they have a hard time articulating them. So I want to give you some ammunition tonight on things that swirl around your head and your heart, and you come to the same conclusion that I do. Maybe there's a different way of saying it. You hear the word culture thrown around in the United States for the last 30 years. What does that word mean, culture? Well, it comes from the root word cult. Now, most of the time, that's a bad word, but in this word, it's just a benign word. What it means is there's a group of people who very well may disagree with a lot of things, and they're different, have different talents and different abilities and different strengths and different weaknesses, and they all look different. But they have one thing in common. They all believe in the same transcendental being and the principles of that transcendental being. That's the cult. Out of that cult comes law. And law will reflect the tenets of the cult. Out of that cult will come education. Education will reflect the tenets of the cult. Out of that cult will come government. Government will reflect the tenets of the cult. Out of that cult will come music and art. All that will reflect the tenets of the cult, and that is the culture. Now you have to ask yourself, okay, what cult is at the center of American culture? Well, whether you like it or not, or the professor at the university likes it or not, the cult at the center of American culture is the God of the Bible. Yes. John Adams, second President of the United States, in the sign of the Declaration, this is what he said. He said, the principles upon which the founders achieved independence were the principles of Christianity. Yes. Well, I reckon the man would know. He was there. Do you know what the official motto is of Harvard University? Nobody talks about this. For Christ and the church. Go back and look at education. Go back and look at what those men wrote, what they said in the first 100 years of American culture. All of that culture reflected the tenets and the principles of the cult. In this case, the God of the Bible. Now look what the founders intended. Here's what they intended. They understood that everybody has an ethnic background. Okay? Every human has an ethnic background. I have an ethnic background. You have an ethnic background. I tell people I'm half Scotch and half Irish. All that means is half of me wants to get drunk and the other half don't want to pay for it. Everybody has an ethnic background. The founders intended for you, when you came to this country, to do two things. To stand with your feet firmly placed on the Constitution of the United States underneath the umbrella called the culture of the United States. It did not matter your ethnic background. When you came through Ellis Island and you got your little booklet, the very first thing you read when you opened the fly, up until about 28 years ago when they took it out, but the very first thing you read was a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, and this is what it said. There is no place in this great country for hyphenated Americans. You are not Asian hyphenated Americans, you're not African hyphenated Americans, you're not Mexican hyphenated Americans, you're not Italian hyphenated Americans. I used to sing with a group called the Pantanas. They were all Italians. I did not know till they told me why there's so many Italians in the United States named Tony. It's because when they loaded them up on boats to bring to the United States, they stamped on their forehead, to New York. I did not know that. You're not Italian hyphenated American. You're not native hyphenated American. You're just Americans. Now that was what the founders intended. They understood everybody had an ethnic background. They wanted you to come stand firmly on the Constitution of the United States underneath the umbrella called the culture of the United States, and that worked very well. Until about 25, 30 years ago, when universities began to spin a new doctrine called multiculturalism. Yes. I despise multiculturalism. It is the biggest promoter of racism in this country.
Yes.
Because this is what multiculturalism says. It says that all cults at the center of a culture are all equal. And it says, therefore, all cultures are equal. And this is what they say. They say, all you blacks underneath the umbrella, you come out from the umbrella and go over here to your own little group and you do the African culture thing. All you Mexicans come out from under the umbrella and you go over here to a group by yourself and do the Latino culture thing. And all you Indians, you come out from under the culture, the umbrella, and you go over here in your group and you do the Native American culture thing. What do you call it when you separate people by race? Racism. It's racism. Multiculturalism is the biggest promoter of racism in this nation, and it is fragmenting this country.
Yes.
Now I want to shift gears about this for just a second. I told you that the cult at the center of American culture was the God of the Bible, and that's true, and that's why the Constitution of the United States is built on the principles of the Bible. Go read it. Go read it. Down at the State House, when I'm down there, I've been arguing for 6 years every time a bill comes up and doesn't have equity. Because law gets its righteousness from its equity. It applies to everybody equally. So it's very, very important that when we pass law, whatever bill we're passing, that it has equity, because that's where its righteousness comes from. So, what happens in America then when you take a biblical principle that props up a law and you strip that biblical principle out, either by educating it out or legislating it out? What happens? Well, let me give you one. These three things always happen when you take a law on the books and you strip out the biblical principle that props it up. This is what happens. Three things every time. There is man-made rules now have to come into play to replace the biblical principle. Once you strip the biblical principle out, it's gone. Now you've got to put man-made rules in there. Man-made rules are never equitable, ever. That's right. Because law was founded on biblical principle, that's why the lady in every courtroom who's holding up the scales of justice has a blindfold. Why? Because what it's saying is justice, and administration of justice does not see you. It could care less who your mama was, or who your daddy was, or what side of the tracks you came from, or what ethnic background you have, since everybody has one. It does not matter. She is blind. Therefore, justice is equitable. Now, when you strip out the biblical principle, it's replaced with man-made rules. Man-made rules are never equitable. In that process is always the creation of an expert and the loss of liberty. Now let me show you. You believe in private property ownership. So do I. So did the founders. Where did they get that? And why is it so important? Because in most countries, particularly Marxist countries and communist countries, the masses do not own private property. Only the elite and the state own private property. The founders thought it was a big deal. Why? What right do you have in America to own private property? Where'd that come from? Well, it came from Genesis. It's called the dominion principle. When God told Adam and Eve, I'm going to give you dominion over the land and over the animals. That dominionship principle is what gives you the right to own private property in this country. Now, because we were supposed to have dominion over animals, I grew up in southwestern Colorado. We had 5 horses, a couple of 3 cows, had a mule. We either shot or raised everything that we ate. Either elk and deer or what we raised. If you had a horse and it got old, and one day it got down out there and couldn't get up. If you couldn't do it because it's been around the family for a long time, you got your neighbor to do it. Somebody went out there and took a pistol or a rifle, and they put that horse out of his misery, because it's going to die. It might be 5 days of suffering, but it's going to die. So you went out there and you did that. Try doing that today. You'll be charged with discharging a firearm within the city or within 100 yards of a dwelling, and cruelty to animals, excessive cruelty to animals, death of an animal. And that's because we started a few years ago to strip out the biblical principle of dominionship. And we have elevated animals now to the same status as humans, sometimes more important than humans. If you don't believe me, go find an eagle's nest. It's got an egg in it. Yes. Grab that egg and throw it off the cliff, see what happens to you. That's worth about a year in a federal penitentiary and a $10,000 fine. Oh, by the way, you can kill a human embryo all day long, and they ain't a misdemeanor. Amen. Okay, so you can't go kill your horse now. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to call the expert. He comes out to your house. What's he do? He kills your horse. Does anybody ever ask, why can the expert kill my horse, but I can't? Oh, that's because he's got a card in his wallet, and it says, I am endowed by the men who make the rules to be a professional, and I can kill horses. Anytime you strip out the biblical principle that upholds law and government, those three things always happen. You replace the principle with man-made rules, it is never equitable. The second thing is the creation of an expert. And the third thing is the loss of liberty. You cannot do what you used to do. I'll give you another one. There was a couple in Texas who'd been married for a while. She got pregnant. At first she wanted a baby. After she was about 6 months pregnant, this happened 18 years ago, 16 years ago. She said to her husband, take a baseball bat and beat me in the stomach till you kill this thing. And he did. What happened to him? He went to the penitentiary in the state of Texas for death of a fetus. What happened to her? Nothing. You see, there is no equity when you remove the biblical principle. Nothing happened to her. What were they supposed to do? They were supposed to go to the expert. What does the expert do? He kills the baby. Does anybody ever ask, why can the expert kill the baby and the daddy can't? Oh, it's because he's got a card in his wallet that says, I'm a professional endowed by the men who make the rules, and I can kill babies. Anytime you strip out the biblical principle that props up law and government, those three things always happen. Man-made rules replace biblical principle. They never have equity. There's always the creation of an expert, and there's always the loss of liberty. Now, I want to show you down at the State House why it's so important to pass bills that have biblical equity. A few years ago, the federal government passed a bill, and I screamed and yelled. I wrote my senators, my congressmen, and I yelled and screamed. And then the legislature down here in Tennessee turned around and enacted the same bill. Long time before I got here. It was a bill and a law called hate crimes. Now let me show you what happens. Let's say there are two men standing at a bar. One on the left's got a cowboy hat. And a guy comes through the back door of the bar and he walks up behind these two men and he looks at the guy with the cowboy hat and he picks up a golf peen hammer and he hits him right on top of the head and knocks him out for 24 hours. The guy goes to the hospital for 3 days. What happens to him? What happens to the guy do? Well, he gets charged with aggravated assault, gets 2 to 5 years, and a $5,000 fine. But he takes the same hammer at the same time and he says to the guy standing on the right, you look like a queer, I hate queers. And he hits him on the head with the same hammer, the same way, knocks him out for 24 hours, and he's in the hospital for 3 days, just like the other guy. What happens now? He gets charged with aggravated assault, gets a 2 to 5 year sentence, and a $5,000 fine, and then he gets charged with a hate crime, and gets an extra year in the penitentiary, and another $1,000 fine. What does that say? Now here's the problem with inequity. This is what it says. It says that the homosexual's head is worth more than the heterosexual's head. It's worth a year more in the penitentiary and $1,000 more. And equity is gone from the law. And anything that does not have biblical equity to it in law smells, because then it's just a biased stick to go beat on people. So, We're in a different place in this country right now than we've ever been.
Yes.
What do we need? Well, we need a lot of things, but here's what we need primarily. We need Christian people in this nation to get serious about following Christ. They need to get serious about serving God. How in the world can Christian people be an influence on their neighbors if they live just as dirty as their neighbors do? How does that happen? If we are going to survive in this country, I think that's one of the linchpins, is that pastors and churches are going to have to begin to preach the Word of God without apology and teach the Word of God with truth. And that means you can't be lazy. You got to study. And pastors need to study, and they need to teach, and Christian people need to get serious about serving God and saving this republic. There is more evil on every hand attacking this nation. And I'll tell you something else. I think that there is a lot of evil systems that are riding this COVID horse. Hold on. So, at the end of the day, you need to contact your state representative and your state senator, and you need to tell them, I'm praying for you, and you need to. You need to. I'm praying for you, and I'm watching you. Always, always honor your oath. And that's what I tell these boys. And it's the center of my heart. I raised my hand and swore one thing in Tennessee to 6.2 million people. And that was that I would always, always defend and maintain the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Tennessee. It is those parchments that keep chains off your feet and a whip off your back.
Yes, that's exactly right.
You need to learn them. You need to learn the Constitution. You need to teach it to your children and teach it to your grandchildren. And pray for folks like me. I appreciate